So soul is a thing, and what a thing it is. More and more I have become critical of Disney and how they're bent on global media dominance, but it's hard to be critical when they keep producing great media like this. From the first 5 minutes of this movie, I was already hooked. I found myself laughing almost uncontrollably, but then, like a lot of Disney and Pixar movies do, the movie gets deep emotionally, and I was moved by the places that this movie was unafraid to explore. Plus, this movie is all about jazz. Disney, and especially Pixar movies, have been exploring some really interesting topics in their last few outings. As much as we all like Disney princess movies, and we all like Disney princess movies, the traditional storytelling style of fairy tales that Disney Animation Studios has been using doesn't seem to hit the same level of complexity as the Pixar movies. Of course, there are great character moments, and the move towards strong independent female characters has been awesome, and the newer movies have really excelled at the exploration of the characters they create, but they're missing something deeper, something that the Pixar movies have. I mean, Up had us all crying within minutes of its runtime. You cried, don't lie to yourself. Inside Out was a brilliant and unique look at exploring emotional and psychological theories of how the mind works, including depression and the importance of feeling sad. But Soul takes its abstractness even further. The level of complexity in Soul's storytelling was far beyond what I was expecting going into the movie. Every part of the movie blends together seamlessly in an effort to reach towards the theme and goal of the movie in a really meaningful way. Soul is ultimately about finding the meaning of life and purpose in that. The characters' goals in opposition to each other, the climax of the story, the setting, of course the music, and even the underlying framework of the narrative all relate back to that theme, purpose. A theme that is incredibly powerful and perplexing on a philosophical level. And so today, I want to talk about soul. But I mean, I went to school for music and philosophy, so maybe this movie just checks all my boxes. Jazz! Interestingly, a movie that deals so heavily with purpose began with an existential crisis. Pixar executive Peter Docter found himself artistically aimless. After winning 2 Academy Awards, first for Up and then again for Inside Out, as well as the critical acclaim from Hugo, Annie, and Golden Globe Awards he'd received for writing and producing credits on Monsters, Inc., Toy Stories 1 and 2, and WALL-E, Docter was struck with an overwhelming sense of dread. What could he do to not necessarily one-up his past works, but differentiate his next projects in terms of themes or storytelling? Was he doomed to just repeat the motions of movie making over and over again? In other words, Docter had lost the spark of joy that movie making had once brought him. Searching for answers, Docter leaned into this feeling and the idea of human personalities left over from Inside Out, and he came upon the ideas of determinism. Determinism is a philosophical argument and school of thought that argues that things are explainable by what has come before. Regarding personalities, this would be another way of explaining or exploring the nature versus nurture argument. Interesting topic, but not the philosophical focus of the movie. After settling on making the movie center around a musician, specifically a jazz musician, Docter sought the help of Kemp Powers in order to tie the character more closely to the African American community. They wanted to develop a well-rounded character that was connected to jazz and the significance of the genre to the African American community and culture in the United States. Due to his contributions, Powers was asked to co-direct the movie, becoming the first African American director of a Pixar animated feature. Behind the scenes, Pixar also had several African American musicians come into the studio to consult on how this community should be depicted. Musicians like Questlove of The Roots, David Diggs of Clipping, and Jean Baptiste, as well as older musicians like Quincy Jones and the venerated jazz pianist Herbie Hancock. If you don't know who that is, he was the pianist for Miles Davis. And holy shit, you better know who Miles Davis is! At least by name. Docter began shaping the movie in 2016, but it wasn't until 2018 for the film to begin production in earnest. Animation on the movie was difficult for 2 reasons. The film focuses on the aspect of souls, as the title suggests, and the depiction of both the great before and the great beyond. The animators needed to create a concept that would be recognizable as otherworldly without adhering to one religious ideology over any other. More importantly was the history of animation and artistic depiction of people of African descent. Animation has for a long time not been kind to black people, and it was important to the team that the African American characters on screen were immediately recognizable as black people, but that this was done respectfully. Lighting effects were used to show how darker skin tones look, and the distinctions between different African American characters are noticeable. Textures of fabric and hair were also agonized over. Realism was prescribed to show how pigments change on parts of the body. Just look at the cracks and color gradient on Joe's hands as he plays the piano. Which brings me to the instrument animation. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine when movies depict characters who are amazing musicians with an actor who can't play or doesn't play as well as the character. I mean, I get it. You hire actors for their acting prowess to create characters, not to play instruments, but it's still irritating. But in Soul, animators were assigned to instruments to make sure that performances looked real. Some of the musicians are not even really in focus when they play, but if you pay close attention, you can see that every hit and nuance and articulation was added. Because if you're gonna make a movie about jazz, then you've got to make it about motherfucking jazz. Some of the musicians that actually helped create the movie are in the cast as well. Both Questlove and Daveed Diggs are in this movie, and they were joined by famous singer and actor Jamie Foxx and other big-name actors and comedians like Tina Fey, Graham Norton, Richard Ayoade, who is one of my all-time favorite actors.
Richmond's out of his room. He's not in his room. He's supposed to be in his room. Why is he out of his room?
This created a really diverse but also powerhouse ensemble. I guess when Pixar or Disney comes knocking, you don't say no. Please hire me to play a villain, like Hades or Dr. Facilier. I got friends on the other side. I'm gonna get into spoilers now, and you're gonna want to know what is going on for the rest of this video to make sense, so please go watch the movie or consider yourself warned. You still here? Okay, here we go. Soul follows substitute music teacher Joe Gardner, who receives a job offer as a full-time middle school band teacher. The same day, he also receives a call from a former student to audition for the great saxophonist Dorothea Williams. Joe is ecstatic as playing jazz piano is his dream, and this just might be his big break. But his mother, however, is not pleased. She wants to see Joe take this teaching position because it will provide him with a steady income and stability in life. Joe passes the audition and is invited to sit in on the gig that night with a chance of becoming a permanent member. Now in a state of euphoria, Joe calls his friends and exclaims his excitement to all around him because he's about to make it big and finally be one of the great cats of jazz. And then he falls down a manhole. Joe, now on his way towards the great beyond, realizes that he has died and is about to pass on before he even got to live his dream. He tries to run and falls off the stairway to heaven. And he's falling from the stairway to heaven. And he winds up in the Great Before, where the new souls are given their personalities and that spark of life they need before they can go down to Earth. Being mistaken for a mentor soul, Joe is assigned to soul number 22. 22 has been trying for whatever passes for a long time in the timeless construct of the Great Before to find their spark, but has never been able to.
Oh, we're going to get into this now. Excuse me.
22, you come out of this dimension right now.
How many times do I have to tell you? I don't want to go to Earth.
Stop fighting this.
Joe thinks he can use 22 as a means of getting back to Earth for his gig that night, and so the two of them make a deal and struggle to find their way back to Earth with the help of some meditating spiritual guides. But 22 winds up in Joe's body, and Joe winds up in the body of a cat. Through all of the wacky hijinks that follow, 22 begins to learn what life could mean, and Joe sees his life from an external point of view. And before they can switch their bodies back, 22 bails, and as Joe is chasing 22, they're both caught by the cosmic consciousness. It turns out that 22 found their spark, but after being berated by Joe, 22 turns into a lost soul, obsessed with their own purposelessness and uselessness. Joe goes back to Earth and plays the jazz gig, but still finds his dream lacking, even though the show was great and his family supported him. He returns to the before and helps 22 break out of their obsession and lets them continue on down to Earth. And the consciousness also lets Joe return. He steps back into his life with a new spring in his step, a whole new outlook on the world, and the ability to explore it in any way he wants. By the way, I'm convinced this whole section where he's avoiding danger is inspired by the short animated production of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue from Fantasia 2000, but that might just be me reading into it. Most of the movie is occupied with the theme of purpose and finding your purpose. In the opening, Joe talks about how he watched as one of his jazz heroes got caught up in the music and floated off stage as they were so engrossed in their process. They had ascended to a new level of being. In a less metaphysical sense, we might call this flow, and I wrote a whole essay about that in Dark Souls. This feeling of being at ease with what you're doing is what Joe believes is the ultimate goal of whatever you're passionate about. Your purpose. The movie also deals with the idea of mentorship and helping others find their purpose. Joe, being a music teacher, sometimes struggles to connect to his students who don't have an interest, but there is one in particular, Connie, who does seem to have a knack for it, which is then paralleled by Joe trying to help Soul 22 find their purpose, what he calls jazzing. In the process of helping 22 find their purpose, Joe becomes more entrenched in this idea of his purpose and identity. In one scene, he's attempting to explain that his purpose is not just his relationship to music, but that his identity is directly linked to the music that he plays and creates. The movie's entire theme actually boils down to one scene, and that is the scene in the subway where Joe in cat form is chasing after Soul 22 in Joe form. Although this point in the movie is not exactly the climax or major conflict, it is a crossroads in which all of the thematic drama comes from. At this point in the story, 22 has begun to realize that life might be worth living after all. Joe has found a way to get his body back so he can achieve his goal, and right at the very end, the cosmic consciousness in the form of Terry achieves their goal of retrieving both the missing Joe and the lost 22. For most of the movie, 22 and Joe have had the same goal, basically. Find a spark so 22 can avoid living, and Joe can use 22's spark as a pass to return to Earth and fulfill his purpose of playing jazz. But once 22 discovers that there might be more to living life, they run away from the solution that will bring Joe his body back. 22 has placed themselves directly in conflict with Joe's goals, and Joe, by virtue of wanting to fulfill his purpose, will do anything to get there, even undercutting someone who has become his de facto pupil. Lastly is Terry, who represents an endpoint that the characters have been outrunning, and now the time is up for both of them. They're both forced to face each other. And this is neat because here Joe becomes the villain. His need to pursue his own purpose and his disappointment at this loss causes him to admonish 22. And the result is that 22 becomes a lost soul, obsessed with their lack of purpose. But Joe, in his own way, has become a lost soul, becoming obsessed with his own purpose, resulting in the pain of others.
When that joy becomes an obsession, one becomes disconnected from life.
When the final conflict does occur, Joe enters into the sand monster's outside protective wall that 22 has created. Here he sees all of 22's doubts and obsessions manifested as the people who either were disappointed or had given up on 22. But the person who is the biggest and loudest manifestation is Joe himself. The bond that occurs between student and mentor, or mentor and mentee, or hell, even friends, is a really meaningful one. These are the people you are closest with, and in some cases look up to. I'm sure at one point or another we've all had great aspirations that might be unrealistic, but that we share with another person only to have those dreams shut down for one reason or another. I think this works so well because of the fact that Joe is a musician. I know of countless people who said they gave up playing their instrument because they had a teacher that made it a miserable experience, rather than sharing the joy of music with them. This inversion of the mentor, the person who should champion your endeavors, to a contrarian is tantamount to betrayal. Of course, this is only what 22 believes, but what it does is show Joe how 22 sees him and his actions towards 22. Much like Inside Out, the main character of the story is actually the villain of the story. Not only did Joe not achieve his goal, but his mindless pursuit of it has affected another person, or soul, but a soul who was placed in his care. The ending is left ambiguous for the audience, but I like to think that Joe realizes that he cannot be single-minded in his pursuit to play jazz. But that when Joe returns to Earth, he continues to play jazz with Dorothea Williams, but he also takes the job as a band teacher. I hope that he realizes his love of playing music doesn't need to exclude being a mentor, and in his love of playing, he also finds a passion for sharing that love through teaching music and jazz. And now, I get to teach some music because the music in this film is so freaking good. I know that Pixar doesn't do musicals, but I kind of really wish they had, because of course, you can't have a movie about jazz that doesn't jazz. Not every movie needs to be a musical, and I know that, and I know we already got The Princess and the Frog, which is pretty jazz, so fine.
But I don't have to be happy about it.
Of course, the movie's title is a play on the word soul, referring to the metaphysical soul of a being in the Platonic sense, but also the feeling that musicians and specifically jazz musicians talk about when they play with meaning. That sense of getting lost in the music that Joe outlines at the beginning, that is playing with soul. And in order to make the characters feel authentic while playing, they need to have a certain degree of musicality and believability. One of the reasons I laughed so hard at the beginning of the movie was because I have a history of teaching music, and this movie nails that music teacher feel to a T. For starters, the classic Disney theme that plays before the movie starts is done as though by a middle school band. Slightly out of key and several instruments are out of time and out of tune. It's still recognizable, but it's so indisputably a middle school band sound. The following and opening scene sees Joe dealing with his band class. All the usual tropes of a band class are there, and every gag is one that I have seen. Some of them I have even done. Except maybe the Skittles one. Please don't let any of my students get any ideas from this. But then one of Joe's students, Connie, starts to solo, and we can see that although she is rough around the edges, there is a feeling there. The soul. In contrast with his students, when Joe plays, or when we hear other professional jazz cats play, there is the expected understanding of musicality and virtuosity. We have moved beyond the basics of learning to read and understand the 12-bar blues to the rich world of complex jazz harmonies, lilted timing of swing, and blue notes that are indicative of the genre. We are no longer in the realm of learning jazz, we are now firmly rooted in jazz and its own musical context. So the characters feel believable when they play, and there is a musical thematicism that plays out between those learning and those who play for a living. As well as Connie, who's unique in her place in the film as she occupies the former, but she has the spark of something that could propel her further. It's such a simple thing to add for such a minor character, but because the movie wants us, the audience, to take its music seriously, it has to take the musical identity of its characters seriously. Beyond that, the movie also takes the music score seriously. A score is really important for a movie, as it can convey a lot of information about scenes and characters. In this case, the movie has not one, not two, but 3 composers to flesh out the unique musical identity. The movie was split into 2 different segments, and you can see this visually really easily. There is this place that we will refer to as the Elsewhere, which is the Great Beyond and the Great Before, and then New York City. This can also be easily discerned sonically. The reason the film has 3 composers is because these 2 segments were composed separately. The New York segments of the movie were all in the style of jazz, and the majority of these scenes were scored by jazz pianist virtuoso Jon Batiste. His goal was to create a kind of jazz that was listener-friendly while still conveying the understanding to the listener that this was purposefully jazz. This is phenomenal work with some really recognizable melodies that make it easy to get into. On the flip side is the Elsewhere, the great conceptual space that is a representation of what is after and what is before life. The music here needed to sound out of this world while still complementing what was happening on screen. And who better to create these kinds of sounds than the composing duo Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross of 9 Inch Nails. Oh yeah, the hard rock / metal band 9 Inch Nails. But if you're worried about that, don't be, because the pair is famous for film scores on movies like Social Network and Gone Girl. Neither of which are particularly kid-friendly, but their work on an out-of-this-world synthesizer-based soundtrack really is stupendous. It carries with it the exact drama and whimsy that a Pixar score needs. It feels distinctly different from the scoring of Randy Newman, Thomas Newman, or Michael Giacchino, but without betraying the legacy that these composers have created for the Pixar filmography. So the jazz styling of Batiste and the out-of-this-world synth score of Ross and Reznor are a bit, well, they're hugely disparate. And yet they work so well together. Let's go back to my favorite scene. As Cat Joe races after Soul 22, Terry opens a door that places them back in the Elsewhere. The floating surrealistic effects here are a cool animation point, but this marks a transition between the world of New York and the Elsewhere. This is also reflected in the score, and it is indicative of the way the score blends the 2 styles together. I can't play the whole thing because of copyright, but listen to the way the jazz chords are transformed and the synth takes over. It feels a little bizarre, but it certainly works, and it perfectly matches the surrealistic animation on screen. And this is just my favorite moment. There are a ton of other points where the styles are blended together. So the movie is all about jazz, and so it's scored by jazz, and then in the Elsewhere we get an abstract soundtrack that is neat and all, but why not have a traditional score for the parts in New York, and then let the jazz songs only be when jazz is being played by a character? Most movies just use an orchestra, so wouldn't that make more sense? It is true that most film scores rely on the instrumentation provided by a philharmonic or symphonic orchestra. These are the sounds of film scoring that we have come to understand, and a lot of that has to do with the history of film music and what has become common practice, but I don't think Soul's jazz score has to do with purposefully neglecting tradition, at least not openly. I think this has more to do with the setting, specifically the setting of New York for jazz and the purposeful move towards synth instruments for the Elsewhere. New York as a setting was done very specifically because of jazz. And yes, I do think that saying jazz in that manner is an appropriate way to describe what it is, and I do think that's the best answer to any question about music in this movie. It's jazz! Go fuck yourself. As I talked about earlier, the creators of Soul took their time to understand what jazz looks like and what it means for the characters in the world of the movie. They decided that Joe would be a jazz performer and how that should tie him to jazz culture and African American identity. This also ties him to the city itself. New York City has its own rich tradition of jazz and its own jazz identity that is informed by those who played there and developed the sound of not just African American jazz, but also the sounds of New York jazz. New York City was one of the great hubs for certain kinds of jazz players, and there are hallmarks of the New York jazz sound that are different from any other. The idea to score this movie with jazz is just as much about Joe's connection to the musical style as it is about the city's connection to that style, and particularly about the legacy that Joe would understand and strive to be a part of.
It's one of our great contributions to American culture. At least give it a chance, Joey.
The city itself also provides its own personality to the film, apart from the history of jazz. 22 and Joe spend their time in quintessentially New York places, such as the New York subway, at a barbershop, and eating the very famous New York-style pizza from one of the plethora of mom-and-pop pizza shops to choose from. In regards to the elsewhere, I think that an orchestra is something that we may find a very commonplace in movie music, and it certainly works well, and I'm not disparaging that, but the beyond is a conceptual place, and even the cosmic consciousness of Jerry and Terry are made to look like abstract versions of people. Synthesizers allow you to create instruments that are only conceptual. With a synth, you can create the sound of 2 or 3 or 10 instruments all layered on top of each other as one instrument in a way that is not physically possible. It also allows you to digitally or electronically create sounds that are entirely unnatural, like a pure sine wave. I think this approach to the elsewhere reflects the setting in a more appropriate way than a traditional orchestra would, and it says a lot about the setting. The elsewhere, in terms of visuals, was made to look pretty peaceful. In the Great Beyond, the use of white and black both convey the absolutes of emptiness and voids, but in the Great Before, the addition of soft blue grass? Is that grass? I'm gonna call it grass. The soft blue grass and the abstract shapes of the personality pavilions, as well as the nondescript shapes of the new souls versus the souls that have already lived, and most prominently the different facets of the universal consciousness, which are all designed like actual abstract art, all convey the idea of abstractness, without needing to commit to any preconceived notion of the afterlife, but it's still clearly depicting that kind of concept. Both of these settings and the need for their music play back into the theme of purpose. New York is rooted in jazz, or rather, jazz is rooted in New York, and this plays into Joe's purpose, and the second meaning of soul. The elsewhere is abstract and plays into the idea of the deterministic purpose of beings. Except I have been lying to you this whole time. And so did the movie. For most of the runtime, the movie gives us this notion that the spark of life is a being's purpose in life. But what we discover is that this is not what completes a person. The cosmic consciousness even explains this.
A spark isn't a soul's purpose. Oh, you mentors and your passions. Your purpose is your meanings of life. So basic.
And so the movie isn't about finding your purpose at all, and that purpose is really kind of a lie anyway. This is where the movie got super philosophical and way smarter than any other Pixar movie, because this movie isn't about emotions or purpose or happiness, it's about existentialism. And jazz. It's still about jazz, don't worry. This movie gave up its existentialist themes the first time we see the Great Beyond, the afterword that occurs after life. The first thing Joe does is reflect on his own death. He's scared to pass away, and later in the Museum of Life, we see that he truly believes that his life amounted to nothing. Like most people, he wants his life to have meaning and value, but to him it appears that this was not the case. And if these two things don't scream existential crisis, I don't know what does. Existentialism is a school of thought that includes a great number of philosophers, some of which would starkly oppose their inclusion in this field. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, Soren Kierkegaard, and Simone de Beauvoir, just to name a few. The idea behind existentialism was to simply ask questions about what the meaning of life is. But one philosopher in particular took this to a place that is most important for the film, and actually recontextualizes a lot of the story. At least it did for me, and I'm going to show you why. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote an essay called Existentialism and Humanism. It's based off a lecture he gave in 1945 on the same topic. There are a few key points in the paper that he posits. The first and most important was his idea that existence precedes essence. What Sartre meant by that is that first you are, and then you can decide what you want to do with that. The meaning of your life is not predetermined. In the movie, we can see that souls clearly exist before they have a spark, but by the movie's own admission, none of what is happening in the beyond is real. It's all a construct used to help human minds grapple eternity in a way that makes sense.
I am the coming together of all quantized fields of the universe, appearing in a form your feeble human brain can comprehend.
What?
You can call me Jerry.
Hence the inclusion of place and individuality, time, and, other constructs. On top of that, we know that the spark is not actually a purpose, and we can assume through this metaphor that it was only when beings are on Earth do they actually choose a purpose, which means you really don't have any purpose. There is no greater reason to live other than what you decide. You exist first, and then you choose what you want to do with that existence. Sartre then goes on to explain that without a reason to exist, anyone is free to choose whatever they want. However, his phrasing is important because he says that we are condemned to freedom. Joe is free to choose whatever he wants to make of his life. He can take the teaching job or he can pursue jazz, but neither of these things will actually give him any sense of completion because neither of them is an end goal, because there is no end goal. Joe may have a predilection and a talent for both teaching and jazz, but he is condemned to make any and all choices and is trapped in the knowledge that there are no right answers. However, instead of just giving up, Sartre says that a real existentialist then becomes a humanist, as the choices they should make within this prison of freedom are based on what that individual person thinks is right. You should live out your life in a way that you think other people ought to live. This is the part that Joe fails at. In his mentorship of Soul 22, he does not live as a humanist. Because of his preconception about the spark of life being his purpose, he instead pursues it single-mindedly, believing that it was the reason he was able to get a pass to Earth. In actuality, his pursuit causes him to eschew the ways of existentialism and therefore humanism, and we see the effects of this on Soul 22. Joe did not pursue the best life possible because he believed that there was a goal, when there was not. I think it would be interesting to see what Joe would say upon his own reviewing of his life museum with the new revelations at the end of the movie. I think Joe would be more interested in seeing the way that he lived his life. Sartre is French, and so he refers to purpose as raison d'être, or reason for being. But what the movie tells us is that there is no reason for being, and it's actually through the eyes of 22 that we discover it's really the little moments that make life worth living. Joie de vivre, if you will. Or perhaps it's not the spectacular moments that make life, but what we do with these small moments in between. What is also interesting is the fact that Joe spends part of this movie as a cat, and the fact that he sees his actions towards 22 reflected back at him through 22's conceptions. Another concept that Sartre posited was what he called the other. This was the idea that our ability as human beings to change our perspective to another person's point of view, and then imagine our actions as that person sees them, is what keeps us in check. So Joe sees his interactions with others in a new light as he spends time looking at his body from this cat's point of view. He sees how people treat him differently if he were to change his outlook, but instead of imagining it through the perspective in his head, he watches it occur as 22 takes control of his body. More literally, when he sees 22's manifestations of their doubts as himself, because those were the actual things that he said, he again becomes the other and sees his actions as others see them. And this helps him to contextualize his actions as wrong through this perspective shift. Teaching moral lessons and existentialism through the power of animation, jazz, and Sartre. This is the best. The way that this movie pushes the theme of purpose through its story, character conflict, music, setting, and then subverts that, all play into creating a movie that is all at once for children, but also for adults, and musicians, and philosophers. And that is why Soul is the most moving and deeply thoughtful animated movie I have ever seen. And here are some last minute thoughts. I really like the music from this movie, although I thought it was interesting that they chose Baptiste, who is a New Orleans musician and not a native New Yorker, but I'm sure he understood New York jazz scene in a way that I probably don't. I also didn't get a chance to talk about the song Epiphany by Ross and Reznor, and it's absolutely breathtaking. There are a few weird things that do get lost in the noise of this movie, like the fact that the cosmic consciousness requires time and space to do things. It kind of defeats the purpose of the before and the beyond being conceptual for human brains, but it serves the story, so it's fine, I guess. The existentialist in me thinks that Joe should have made peace with his life and passed on at the end, but I get it. It's a bit of a downer, and it's still just a children's movie that happens to be about existentialism and jazz. Hey, thanks so much for watching that video. If you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like and share it, and don't forget to subscribe like it's your only purpose in life if you want to see more. I did think it was a little weird to have the first main character that was African American in a Pixar movie lose their body so early in the film's runtime, and then also have that character's body voiced by Tina Fey, but it serves the story, so I understand. You can always hear more of my ideas on other episodes of This Is a Thing, as well as cool conversations on Cinemasters and short reviews on the long and the short of it. All of that's happening right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.